The final nail in her old life was not the coffin lid closing over her husband, but the sharp, metallic click of her brother-in-law's office door shutting behind her. Thomas stood on the other side of his polished desk, a man made of ledgers and straight lines. He did not offer her a seat. He did not offer her comfort. He offered her the law. The Maine farm, the good bottomland, the sturdy house she had shared with his brother. It was all entailed, belonging to the male line. It now belonged to him. What belonged to her, Ilara, was what the law allowed a widow without children: her personal effects and whatever her husband had held in his own name, free and clear. That amounted to a small, rocky parcel of land on the northern ridge known to everyone in Promise Creek as the Scab. It was a joke of a property, a patch of wind-scoured granite and stunted pine trees that could not grow grass, let alone crops. It was worthless. Thomas slid a thin envelope across the desk. $50, he said, his voice as dry as dust. A gesture of goodwill from my brother's memory. It was not goodwill. It was severance. It was the price of her disappearance. He was buying her exit from the family, from the town, from memory itself. The deed to the Scab was tucked inside. She took the envelope. Her hands did not shake. Her voice did not crack. She had done all her weeping in the long nights beside a sickbed. There were no tears left. There was only a cold, hard knot in the pit of her stomach. She looked at Thomas, at his clean collar and his soft hands, and saw the entirety of the town's judgment in his eyes. She was a problem to be solved, a loose end to be tied off. Ilara walked out of the office and into the main street of Promise Creek. The autumn air was sharp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the coming cold. People saw her. They nodded with a kind of pained pity that was worse than scorn. They knew. In a town this small, the law traveled faster than gossip. The widow was out. She had nothing but the Scab. Her first and only stop was Gable's Mercantile. The bell above the door chimed a cheerful, lying sound. Mr. Gable stood behind the counter, polishing a glass jar. He was a man who measured the world in profit and loss, and he saw a woman who was a total loss. "Ilara," he said, his tone dripping with practiced sympathy. "A terrible business, a terrible business." He leaned forward. "The stage leaves for the east tomorrow morning. For a woman alone, it's the sensible thing." She felt the weight of the $50 in her pocket. It was enough for a ticket, enough to vanish and become someone else's problem. It was the path of surrender. The town expected it. Thomas demanded it. The cold knot in her gut tightened. "I'm not taking the stage," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the store's dusty air. Gable blinked, surprised. "But the Scab?" "Child, nothing lives up there but wind and misery. There's not even a proper well, just an old prospector's shack, and I doubt it's still standing." "I'll need a good axe," Ilara said, ignoring his advice. "A double bit, if you have one, and a shovel with a reinforced handle, a box of nails, 20 pounds of flour, and 10 of salt." He stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. The pity in his eyes curdled into something else, a dismissive certainty. He was looking at a fool, a stubborn, prideful fool who was choosing to die slowly instead of leaving with dignity. He turned and began to gather the items, his movements stiff with disapproval. The total came to $7.40, a fortune she could not afford, but a price she had to pay. As she counted out the coins, her husband's dog, Buster, whined at her feet. He was a scruffy, barrel-chested mutt, the only living thing that was still truly hers. Thomas had tried to keep him, but the dog had refused to leave her side. Now he stood as her only guard, his tail tucked low, sensing the hostility in the air. She hefted the axe. Its weight felt solid, real. It was a tool for breaking things, but also for building them. She loaded her meager supplies into a burlap sack, settled the axe on her shoulder, and turned her back on the mercantile. She turned her back on the pity and the judgment. She turned her back on Promise Creek and, with the dog at her heels, began the long walk north, toward the worthless land that was now her only home. The journey to the scab was a climb into desolation. The path dwindled from a wagon-rutted track to a faint deer trail winding through skeletal pines. The land grew harder, the soil thinning until it was just a gritty wash over plates of ancient gray stone. The wind was a constant presence, a physical force that pushed against her, whispering of failure. It clawed at her shawl and stung her eyes. She carried the sack of supplies over one shoulder, the weight digging into her bones. Buster trotted ahead, then circled back, his panting breath misting in the cold air. He was her only compass, the only warm thing in this landscape of stone and sky. The sun was a pale coin, offering little heat. By the time she reached the ridge, her muscles burned with a fire that gave no warmth. And there it was, the shack. Mr. Gable had been generous in his description. It was less a building and more a suggestion of one. The walls were warped gray boards, riddled with gaps you could throw a cat through. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired old horse, its shingles peeling away to reveal the raw planking beneath. A stone chimney leaned at a dangerous angle, a single gust away from collapse. It was a ruin, a monument to forgotten hope. Ilara dropped her sack. The axe fell from her numb fingers and clattered against the rock. She stared at the dilapidated hovel, and for the first time since the funeral, a wave of true, bottomless despair washed over her. The town was right. Thomas was right. This was not a place to live. This was a place to die. The cold of the rock seeped through the soles of her worn boots, a cold that felt like it was coming from the center of the earth. Tears she thought were long gone pricked at her eyes, hot and sharp. Buster nudged his head against her hand, whining softly. She sank to her knees, the rough granite biting into her flesh. She had chosen this. She had spent her last real money on tools for this pile of sticks. The sheer, monumental folly of it threatened to swallow her whole. The wind howled around the corners of the shack, a mocking, triumphant sound. She stayed there for a long time as the light began to fail, the cold hardening her despair into a kind of numb paralysis. It would be so easy to just lie down, to let the wind and the cold do their work. It would be an end to the struggle. But Buster would not let her. He began to bark, a sharp, insistent sound. He ran to the shack's dilapidated porch, a few planks laid over a low stone foundation, and began scratching frantically at the boards, looking back at her with an urgent plea in his eyes. He whined, a high, desperate noise. Slowly, stiffly, Ilara pushed herself to her feet. Her body screamed in protest. She followed the dog, her movements mechanical. He was scratching at a single, loose plank near the wall of the shack. She knelt, her fingers fumbling with the cold, splintered wood. With a grunt of effort, she pried it up. Beneath it was not the frozen, rocky ground she expected. It was darkness, a pocket of still, silent air. She reached her hand into the opening. The air that met her skin was not frigid like the wind outside. It was cool, yes, but it was still. It felt like cellar air, damp, earthy, and profoundly, unnervingly calm. There was no wind down there. Curiosity, a long-dormant instinct, stirred within her. She lit the small lantern she'd carried. Lowering it into the hole, she peered into the blackness. The light revealed not a shallow crawl space, but a deep cavity. The shack had been built over a natural depression in the rock, a kind of sheltered hollow. The earth inside was dark and dry, a mix of soil and gravel, not solid granite. It went down at least 4 feet and seemed to extend the entire length of the shack. The wind screamed over the roof above her head, but down in that hole, the lantern flame barely flickered. The stone foundation and the earth itself were a shield, a thermal mass. It held the deep, steady temperature of the earth, resisting the savage fluctuations of the air. It was a cellar, waiting to be dug. It was a shelter, waiting to be shaped. The town saw a worthless shack on a worthless patch of rock. They saw a wind-swept grave. They had not looked down. They had not seen the secret the land was holding. A flicker of something fierce and hot sparked in Alara's chest, chasing away the despair. It was not hope, not yet. It was something harder. It was resolve. The town was wrong. The next morning, she began to dig. The work was a special kind of hell. The ground beneath the shack was not soft loam. It was a dense, compacted mix of clay, gravel, and stone that had been settling for centuries. The shovel blade scraped and rang against hidden rocks. The handle vibrated, sending jarring shocks up her arms and into her shoulders. Her hands, accustomed to needlework and kneading dough, were shredded within the first hour. Blisters rose, broke, and bled, leaving weeping patches of raw skin. She wrapped them in strips torn from her petticoat, but the cloth just ground the dirt deeper into the wounds. Every shovelful was an agony. Every rock she pried loose felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She worked in the dim light, filtering through the floorboards she had removed, her world shrinking to the scrape of metal on stone and the ragged sound of her own breathing. Sweat poured down her face, stinging the cuts and her eyes. Her back screamed. Her legs trembled with exhaustion. At the end of the first day, she had barely deepened the hole by a foot. She collapsed onto her bedroll, too tired to eat, and fell into a sleep so deep it felt like a temporary death. But she woke the next morning with the sun, the pain in her body a screaming reminder of her purpose. She ate a piece of dry bread, drank from the brackish seep she'd found a quarter-mile away, and descended back into the earth. The work became a rhythm. Dig, pry, haul, dump. The pile of excavated earth grew outside the shack, a testament to her relentless labor. She learned the language of the ground. She learned to read the grain of the stone, to find the weaknesses where she could pry out a boulder. She learned that her body, which she thought was soft and breakable, was capable of hardening. The blisters calloused over. The screaming muscles settled into a dull, permanent ache. She grew lean and tough, her frame corded with a strength she never knew she possessed. As she dug deeper, she began to build. She hauled stones from the surrounding ridge, fitting them together to line the excavated walls, creating a sturdy, deep foundation that extended far below the original shack. It was slow, painstaking work. She had no mortar at first, so she packed the gaps with the dense clay she was digging out, creating a surprisingly solid barrier against the earth. The shack above was no longer just sitting on the ground, it was anchored to it. Her vision for the space grew with every foot she dug. This would not be just a cellar, this would be her home. She excavated a main chamber directly under the center of the shack, deep enough for her to stand upright. Then she began digging a long, narrower trench extending from it, like the arm of a cross. It was 5 feet deep and 3 feet wide, a subterranean tunnel protected by the earth. After a month of this brutal, solitary labor, she took a day and turned her attention to the shack above. The leaning chimney was the greatest threat. Using rocks she had hauled and the clay and mud mixture as a crude mortar, she painstakingly rebuilt it from the ground up. She built a new firebox, wider and deeper than the original, lining it with the flattest, most solid stones she could find. It was not beautiful, but it was strong. When she lit the first fire, the smoke drew perfectly, a thin, gray ribbon rising straight into the sky. The stones of the hearth soaked up the heat, and she could feel their warmth radiating for hours after the fire was banked. It was the first true warmth she had felt in weeks, a small, fierce victory. With the last of her money, she made the trip back to Promise Creek. It was a calculated risk. She walked into Gable's Mercantile, thinner, harder, her hands scarred and her face smudged with dirt. The whispers started instantly. Buster growled low in his throat. Mr. Gable's eyes widened, first in surprise, then in that familiar, condescending pity. "Child, you're still here. I thought for sure—" "I need 6 laying hens," she said, cutting him off, "and a rooster, the hardiest you've got, and more salt." Gable laughed. It was not a kind sound. "Hens? On the scab? Elara, the first winter wind will blow them clean into the next county, if the foxes don't get them first. This is foolishness." "Nevertheless," she said, her voice flat. She laid the coins on the counter. He shook his head, taking her money as if it were a donation to a lost cause. The entire transaction was a public performance of her folly. People watched her leave, a woman buying chickens for a place no living thing could survive. They called her the Dirt Widow now, a name born of mockery and a perverse kind of awe at her stubbornness. Getting the crated chickens back up the ridge was another ordeal, but she managed it. She did not put them in a flimsy coop outside. She guided them down a ramp she'd built into the long, narrow trench she had dug beneath her home. It was their chicken run. It was 5 feet underground, shielded from the wind, insulated by the earth. The temperature down there barely changed, staying cool in the day and holding a measure of warmth at night. She filled it with dirt and scraps for them to scratch in. With a steady supply of water and feed, protected from predators and the elements, her hens were safer than any livestock in the valley. She finished her preparations as the first snows began to fall. The shack above was now chinked and sealed, used for storage and as an airlock against the cold. Her true home was below. She had a bed in the main chamber, a small table, and shelves carved into the earthen walls. The great stone hearth from the room above radiated its heat down, keeping the subterranean space from freezing. A clever system of clay-lined channels collected rainwater from the roof, funneling it into a small cistern she had dug and lined in the corner, providing clean water without having to venture out. Her world was small, dark, and ordered. It smelled of damp earth, wood smoke, and chickens. It was a fortress built of desperation and sheer will. She had her dog for warmth, her fire for heat, her hens for food, and a mountain of firewood stacked against the shack, a defiant bulwark against the coming winter. The town could mock her. Let them. She was ready. The mockery did not stop. It became a kind of town sport. Hunters passing near the ridge would report back to Gable's store with tales of the Dirt Widow's doings. "She's got a woodpile bigger than the church," one would say, to general laughter. The assumption was that she was mad, engaged in a pointless, frantic industry before the inevitable end. Mr. Gable himself made one final journey up the trail before the deep snows came. He framed it as a mission of charity, a final offer of salvation. He stood before her patched-up shack, his face a mask of concern that failed to hide his smugness. "Elara," he began, gesturing at the immense woodpile, "this is impressive, but it won't be enough. The wind on this ridge is a killer. It will find a way in." He offered her a position. His wife needed help in the scullery. It was honest work, he said. A warm bed, 3 meals a day. It was a chance to come in from the cold, to admit defeat gracefully. She stood in the doorway of her shack, Buster at her side, and looked at him. She thought of the warm, still air in her shelter below. She thought of her 6 healthy hens, already laying their first small, precious eggs. She thought of the quiet satisfaction of her own labor. "I am grateful for the offer, Mr. Gable," she said, her voice even, "but I am home." He left, shaking his head, his prophecy of her doom delivered. The story of her refusal cemented her legend as the town fool. The dirt widow of the scab, they called her, a woman who chose to live in a hole in the ground out of pure, stubborn pride. Then winter came in earnest, and the world shrank. The snow fell, deep and silent, burying the landscape in a blanket of white. The wind, once a constant whisper, rose to a ceaseless howl. For Elara, life settled into a deep and solitary routine. Each morning began in the dark. She would climb from her subterranean chamber into the shack above, the change in temperature immediate and brutal. The air in the shack was cold, but it was still. Outside, the wind screamed. She would feed the fire, coaxing the embers back to life until the stone hearth began to glow, its heat a living presence. Then, she would tend her systems. She would check the cistern, ensuring the feed from the roof wasn't frozen. She would descend into the chicken run, the air thick with the scent of poultry and earth. The hens would cluck a greeting. In the soft light of her lantern, she would gather the eggs, 4 or 5 a day, each one a perfect, miraculous treasure. They were a promise kept. Protein, life. She checked her snare lines in the stunted woods nearby, occasionally catching a rabbit to add to her larder. She spent the long, dark hours mending her clothes, oiling her tools, and planning. Her world was governed by the simple, brutal laws of heat, water, and food. She was utterly alone, but she was not idle. She was the sovereign of her small, underground kingdom. The first test came not from the cold, but from hunger. A pack of wolves, driven down from the high peaks by the deepening snow, caught the scent of her chickens. One night, Buster erupted in a frenzy of barking. Elara grabbed her axe and peered through a crack in the shack door. 5 lean, gray shapes circled the shack, their eyes glowing like malevolent embers in the moonlight. They pawed at the stone foundation, snarling in frustration. They could smell the livestock, but they could not get to it. The walls she had built, the deep stone footings, held them back. They could not dig under. She had dug there first. After an hour of fruitless circling, they melted back into the night. Her system had held. She was safe. She felt no fear, only a cold clarity. The world outside her shelter was hostile. Everything in it was either trying to kill her or to take what was hers. Her survival depended not on luck, but on the integrity of the walls she had built, the heat of the fire she maintained, and the rhythms she obeyed without fail. The town could have its society and its scorn. She had the earth, the stone, and the fire. And she had her secrets, buried deep beneath the floorboards. In late January, the winter turned. It was not a gentle thaw, but a shift from a hard season to a malevolent one. A weather system the likes of which no one had ever seen descended from the Arctic, a solid wall of impossible cold. They would later call it the ice scourge of '83. First came the freeze. The temperature plummeted not over days, but over hours. It dropped to 10 below zero, then 20, then 30. The air grew so cold it felt sharp in the lungs, a pain with every breath. In Promise Creek, the world began to break. The sound of splitting wood echoed through the town as house beams and porch posts contracted in the brutal cold and cracked like gunshots. Windows frosted over, then shattered. The river, which had never frozen solid in living memory, became a road of iron-hard ice. Ilara felt the change even in her burrow. The air in the shack above became dangerously cold, and the stones of her hearth, for the first time, seemed to be losing their battle for warmth. But underground, in her living chamber, the insulating power of the earth held. The temperature dropped, but only to a few degrees above freezing. It was cold, but it was survivable. The wind shrieked over the roof, a sound like tearing metal, a physical assault on the world. Down below, it was just a dull, distant roar. She kept the fire roaring, feeding it from her colossal woodpile, knowing that the heat radiating through the stone floor was the only thing keeping her and her animals alive. Then came the snow. It was not a gentle flurry, but a horizontal blizzard, driven by winds that stripped bark from trees. It fell for 3 days without stopping, burying everything. In town, the people's preparations, designed for a normal winter, began to fail catastrophically. Firewood, stacked in open-sided sheds, was buried under impassable drifts. The town's well froze solid. Livestock, even in their barns, began to die, their bodies freezing where they stood. The roof of the meeting hall, burdened by an impossible weight of snow, groaned and then collapsed with a sound that was swallowed by the storm. Panic, cold and sharp as the air itself, began to seep into the houses of Promise Creek. Their confidence, their conventional wisdom, their sturdy wooden walls, it was all shattering under the weight of a nature they had never truly respected. They were trapped, they were cold, and they were running out of everything. Inside her shelter, Ilara's routine continued. The fire burned steady. The cistern still held water. And in the long earthen tunnel beneath her floor, the chickens, oblivious to the apocalypse raging above, scratched in the dirt and laid their eggs. The contrast was absolute. Outside, a world of white chaos and screaming wind. Inside, the quiet, orderly sounds of life. The crackle of the fire, the soft clucking of hens, the steady breathing of her dog. She was not fighting the storm. She had built her world outside of its reach. She was still there. The town was wrong. The arrival came on the 4th day of the blizzard. The wind had not lessened, and the world outside was a churning vortex of white. Buster began to bark, not the sharp, aggressive sound he used for wolves, but a confused, urgent cry. He stood at the door of the shack, his body tense, his ears cocked against the roar of the storm. Ilara pulled on her heaviest coat and unbarred the door, opening it just a crack. The wind tore at it, a physical blow. At first, she saw nothing but the swirling snow. Then, a shape resolved itself out of the chaos. A figure, stumbling, falling, crawling toward her shack. It was a man, so covered in ice and snow he was barely recognizable. He collapsed a few feet from her porch. Her first instinct was to bar the door. The world outside was death. Letting it in was a risk to her meticulously balanced system. But the man groaned, a sound of pure agony, and she could not turn away. With Buster at her heels, she plunged into the storm, the cold hitting her like a physical hammer. She grabbed the man's arm, and with strength she had earned in the pit, dragged him out of the snow and into the relative shelter of the shack. She slammed the door against the wind and barred it. In the dim light, she brushed the ice from the man's face. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Mr. Gable. His face was a mask of frostbite, his lips blue, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. He was half frozen and delirious. "My daughter," he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. "Lila, the fever. She's wasting away. The doctor said, broth. She needs protein, something warm. But there's nothing. The meat is frozen solid. The last of the hens froze in their coop. Nothing. There's nothing left." He was begging. This man, who had mocked her, who had pronounced her doom, who had represented the town's collective, smug certainty, was on his knees in her home, begging for help. For a single, cold moment, she felt the bitter satisfaction of it. He was wrong. They were all wrong. She was right. She could send him away. She could let him and his town face the consequences of their own foolishness. Her resources were finite. Her firewood, her food. It was a careful calculation of her own survival. Helping him would cost her. It would threaten the balance she had bled to build. But then she saw the image of his daughter, a small girl with bright ribbons in her hair she'd seen in town once. She saw not the arrogant merchant, but a desperate father. Her choice was not about him. It was about who she was. She had not survived by becoming as hard and unforgiving as the stone she lived in. She had survived by creating life where there was none. She turned from him without a word. She moved a heavy rug from the floor, lifted the thick wooden trap door, and gestured for him to follow her down the ladder into the earth. The warmth hit him first, a wave of steady, subterranean heat that felt like a miracle. His frost-numbed face began to sting as blood returned to it. He stumbled down the ladder into her living chamber, his eyes wide, uncomprehending. He saw the neat bed, the shelves of preserved goods, the steady glow from the stones of the hearth above. It was impossible. This warm, ordered living space could not exist on the wind-blasted hellscape of the scab. Then he heard it, a soft, contented clucking sound. Ilara took her lantern and led him toward the narrow passage. She unlatched a small wooden gate, and the lantern light fell upon the chicken run. 6 hens and a rooster scratched in the deep, dry earth, their feathers sleek, their eyes bright. They were healthy. They were alive. In a world frozen solid, here was a pocket of impossible life. Gable stared, his mouth hanging open. He could not reconcile what he was seeing with the woman the town had ridiculed. The dirt widow, the fool in the hole. He watched as Ilara reached into a nesting box and pulled out an egg. It was brown and smooth and warm to the touch. She gathered 4 more. He sank to his knees on the earthen floor, the fight gone out of him. The warmth of the shelter, the sight of the impossible chickens, the quiet competence of this woman. It all broke through his pride and his prejudice. The world he knew, the rules he lived by, had been proven utterly false. "We called you the dirt widow," he whispered, his voice cracking with shame and awe. He looked around the subterranean haven she had carved from nothing. My God, we were the fools, digging our own graves in our fine wooden houses. Ilara looked down at the man who had been her chief tormentor. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." Vengeance was a luxury, and she was a creature of necessity. She saw only the task at hand. She placed the 5 warm eggs into a small basket. She went to her shelves and added a jar of rabbit broth she had canned in the fall. Then she climbed back into the shack above. She took a thick woolen blanket from her own bed and wrapped it around his shoulders. From the massive woodpile inside the shack, she gathered a heavy load of dry, split pine and bundled it with rope. She pushed the basket, the broth, and the wood into his arms. His own were shaking too much to hold them securely. "Go to your daughter," she said. Her voice was not kind, nor was it cruel. It was simply a statement of fact, a command to do the next necessary thing. He looked at her, his eyes swimming with tears that froze instantly on his cheeks as she opened the door. He wanted to say more, to apologize, to explain, but the words would not come. He simply nodded, a broken man, and stumbled back out into the storm, carrying the impossible gifts of warmth and life from the woman his town had left for dead. The storm broke 2 days later. The wind died, and a weak, watery sun appeared in the sky, revealing a world transformed, buried under a monolithic shroud of white. The people of Promise Creek emerged from their cracked and frozen houses like survivors of a shipwreck. The town was devastated. Half the livestock was gone. Several of the outlying homesteads had simply vanished under the snow. But Lila Gable lived. The warm broth and the protein from the eggs had turned the tide of her fever. And the story her father told, a rambling, half-delirious tale of a warm cave and impossible chickens, spread through the starving, freezing town like wildfire. At first, they did not believe it. It was the fantasy of a frost-bitten mind. But the evidence was there. The eggs, the firewood, the fact that Lila was recovering. A small party of men, led by a humbled Mr. Gable, made the trek up to the scab. They came not to mock, but to witness. When they arrived, Elara was on her porch, splitting wood with a steady, powerful rhythm. She stopped and watched them approach, her axe held loosely in her hand. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet watchfulness. Gable spoke for them. We need help," he said, the words costing him everything. "We've lost most of our food stores. The town is starving." Elara looked past him at the faces of the men who had laughed at her, who had whispered about her, who had dismissed her. She looked at their gaunt, desperate faces. Then she nodded once. She led them down into her shelter. The scene repeated itself, the shock at the warmth, the disbelief at the sight of the healthy chickens, the awe at her neat rows of preserved food and her organized, functional world. They stared like children seeing a magic trick. They had come expecting to find a half-mad hermit on the verge of death. They found a queen in her earthen castle, a woman who had not merely survived the storm, but had been untouched by it. She shared what she could. Each family in town received 2 eggs, a fortune beyond price. She gave them knowledge, explaining the principles of her shelter, the deep foundation, the insulation of the earth, the thermal mass of the stone hearth. She showed them how the wind, their greatest enemy, had been rendered powerless. The name Dirt Widow was never spoken in Promise Creek again. It died that day, buried by a mountain of shame and respect. They started calling her place Elara's Haven, and they spoke her name with a reverence usually reserved for founders and saints. When spring finally came and the great melt began, the town did not just rebuild, it changed. Men began digging new foundations, going deeper into the earth. They built stone-lined cellars and subterranean storage rooms. They learned to bank their homes with earth and stone, creating insulation against the wind. The architecture of Promise Creek began to reflect the hard-won lessons of the ice scourge, lessons taught by the woman they had cast out. Her methods became their methods. Her survival became their blueprint. Her story spread beyond the valley, carried by trappers and traders. The tale of the widow on the scab who tamed the winter became a frontier legend, a story of resilience that gave hope to settlers in other harsh places. The worthless piece of land became a landmark, a place people would point to as proof that what one person discards, another can build a world upon. Elara never sought their praise, nor did she ever fully rejoin their society. She remained on her ridge, in the home she had clawed from the unforgiving earth. She traded her surplus eggs and vegetables for things she could not make. But she never depended on the town again. She had found her own kind of peace, a quiet strength born of solitude and immense labor. Years later, an old woman now, she would sit on her porch in the evening sun, the faithful Buster's descendant lying at her feet. She would look down at the lights of Promise Creek twinkling in the valley below, a town that now stood stronger, wiser, and more humble because of her. She had been stripped of everything, left with nothing but a patch of rock and her own will. And with them, she had not just built a shelter, she had built a life, and in doing so had rewritten the definition of wealth, of strength, and of wisdom for everyone who knew her name.